Yo, what's poppin'? Big Ziff here. Today we're going to be talking about different team comps for our beautiful girl Ayaka. Now I'm just going to get it out of the way. I'm mainly going to be talking about Perma Freeze and Freeze comps, as these are most likely going to be one of the best, if not the most consistent teams for Ayaka. I'm sure you can build Melt comps and, Phys comps maybe, although I'm going to explain why Phys is not going to be a good option. Before we get into the video, I'm going to kindly ask you guys to like and subscribe if it helps you. And as always, guys, run who you want to run. Run units who you like and love, and they're essential to your team, whatever. Don't take everything in this video I say so seriously. This is just purely based around information that I've gathered and previous knowledge that we have about the success of freeze comps in general. So with that being said, let's dive right into it. So obviously, for anyone who's new to Genshin or not, you need to know that in order to apply freeze or perma freeze, you're going to need constant cryo and hydro application. Now for the cryo application, we know that Ayaka will pretty much be able to provide all of the cryo that we need with not only her skills, but her alternate sprint as well, because it will constantly infuse her sword with the cryo element. For hydro application, however, usually Xingqiu is the best option because he can still apply a lot of hydro when he's off the field. I know there's other characters that can do that as well, but really when we see permafreeze comps, we know that Xingqiu is obviously one of the best, if not the best, units to constantly apply hydro with. He allows for a fantastic synergy with a cryo DPS. So for the third slot on your team, you definitely could sub out whoever you want, but I'm going to make a recommendation that you really are going to want a second cryo unit for a few reasons. One of them being that you really need a battery for Ayaka's high cost ultimate. Obviously, you don't need to always have her ultimate with 100% uptime if you're running her as a main DPS, but I think if we're really going for extra damage here, you really want to get her ultimate as much as you can. And obviously after that, you get the cryo resonance, which is what people run 2 cryo units for usually. So you'll get that extra crit rate against frozen enemies or enemies affected by cryo. And for the last slot on the team, you usually are going to want another character who can help with boosting or buffing your team, especially your main DPS, without ruining that frozen status when we're talking about a permafreeze comp. And for that slot, you essentially have 3 options, which is going to be another hydro unit, another cryo unit, or an Anemo unit, with Anemo being the best option in my opinion. Now, Anemo is likely going to be one of the best final support options for a few reasons. Now, reason number 1 is because the Viridescent Venerer set has insane elemental resistance debuffs that can be applied to enemies so that you can deal more cryo damage constantly. Number 2 is going to be that Anemo units can apply crowd control, which is going to be extremely helpful for Ayaka and Xingqiu to be able to group enemies up and try and permafreeze them. And number 3, and most importantly probably, is that Anemo actually doesn't stop freezing from happening, whereas a lot of other elements, they actually would ruin the permafreeze from being able to keep going, whereas Anemo actually doesn't break that freeze component. So it's really, really awesome. Now that we've kind of gone over the basics, let's actually dive into the different teams that you can build. So I think a fantastic 4-star team, and one of the better teams overall actually, unless you have Kazuha, is going to be Ayaka, Xingqiu, Diona, and Sucrose. So let me go over why that is. For many of these Ayaka permafreeze comps, I really, really like Diona on the team because not only do a ton of people have a free copy of her from the event, but maybe not new players, but she also will fill that second cryo unit role for the cryo resonance. On top of this, she's going to be a battery for Ayaka to help with her ultimate uptime. And as everyone knows, Diona is going to fulfill that healer role with a shield all in one. And you can also run her with a sacrificial or a Favonius warbow, and you're going to have really, really high energy recharge. And it's just going to be, I think it's just going to have some really great synergy in a team comp. Now, if you don't want to use Diona, there are some other healing options, which we'll talk about later. One of them that I'll quickly mention right now is you could also try using Noelle, as she gives shields and heals, but I will explain a little bit further in the video that Geo could actually be a partial problem, maybe not specifically for Noelle, but for other characters like Zhongli and Albedo, which we'll cover in a little bit, like I said. Now, if you don't want to run Diona, you can run other cryo units like Chongyun or Kaya, for example, to get that guaranteed cryo application when they're off the field. And you can try and run some sort of other healer like Jean or Bennett. Again, I'm going to explain why some of them aren't as good in a little bit, but just know that there are some amazing permafreeze teams that utilize Chongyun or Kaya on them. Next up, going down the list of cryo units, we have Rosaria and Ganyu. Rosaria is kind of to me, she's not that fantastic fantastic, I think, in this sort of scenario. Ganyu could actually end up being pretty good. So obviously having either of these characters on the team would still supply that second cryo unit that we need for the resonance. But Rosaria specifically, she doesn't have a ton of support capabilities in terms of this permafreeze team. Her ultimate obviously will continue to tick cryo over time, but I just think in terms of the different cryo units that we have access to, especially a lot of these free-to-play options, she's not going to be the best unit to use. Ganyu, on the other hand, we know that with her ultimate, it actually could be insane for some support permafreeze teams because of its radius and how much cryo it actually applies over time. However, I know that a lot of people don't have Ganyu, and on top of this, Ganyu is generally going to be the main DPS anyways, so it's going to be kind of tricky with some team comps with AYAKA, I think, but I know that a ton of streamers and people with Ganyu are going to make this team work anyways, so I figured I would just throw it in there. Again, I'm not saying she is a bad support in this case. She obviously can deal an insane amount of damage and has even her elemental skill with the taunt, which has more support capability. But I just think that someone like Diona, who can heal, apply cryo, be a battery, and have shields all in one, I think she really just kind of fulfills like what a true support would be. But you can still run Ganyu if you want. Now, just to sum up the cryo units, like I just said, I really think Diona, Chongyun, and Kaya will serve as the best cryo units. That's my own personal opinion. The reason behind that is really because they are great 4-stars that people can use. A lot of people are going to have them unlocked, some even with extra constellations, which will be great. And one other unit that I forgot to mention is obviously Chi-Chi. You can run her for heals if you want, but just know that she will not generate any energy particles for AYAKA, so I really don't recommend her as kind of that battery role. You can run her for a healing role as well, though, if you want, and just, not really worry about AYAKA's ult uptime if that's something you don't really mind. Now, in terms of other Hydro units, I know you could try and use Mona or Barbara as well, but I really think that Xingqiu is going to fulfill that Hydro support role the best by far, just based on a lot of the permafreeze comps we've seen in the past. However, it's worth noting that if you're going for the biggest single hit DPS numbers, Mona is definitely going to be the one for you in that case. She can not only run the thrilling tails, but with her ultimate, as we know, it's going to do massive damage when that bubble gets popped. She also has some support capabilities with her taunt, her E ability that can not only generate some hydro and some particles, but it'll allow some enemies to be grouped up. I just don't think that in terms of the hydro role, that's not really what we're going for in this case. We're trying to get constant hydro as much as we can, and I really think Xingqiu is going to fulfill that the best, because not only can you run him with something like 2-piece Hydro, 2-piece Noblesse, you can also run him with a Sack Sword, which is going to give him his E ability multiple times usually, and his ultimate just is going to constantly apply Hydro, which we really don't see from many other characters in the game. Similar situation to Mona with Barbara. She can use the Thrilling Tales, apply Hydro, and she actually can heal your team, but she is nowhere near as useful when applying Hydro as Xingqiu, like we just mentioned. And we've seen in the past that Barbara is really an annoying unit to deal with sometimes, because your team could actually be the ones getting permafrozen from her elemental skill. And lastly, if you plan to use Child as a Hydro unit, then AYAKA will likely have to become a sub DPS and not be your main DPS. For that sort of team, you definitely could run AYAKA, Child, Diona, and then some sort of Anemo slot, which we're going to cover Anemo characters right now. So in terms of Anemo characters, our options are Kazuha, Venti, Jean, Sucrose, Anemo main character, and Sayu, who is going to come in Inazuma. Starting off with Sucrose, we know that she has some pretty good crowd control, but you don't necessarily need to run Elemental Mastery on her because Freeze doesn't actually deal damage, so the Elemental Mastery is almost useless in that case, but you can still run her with that 4-piece Viridescent for the Elemental Shreds for Cryo, and you can still have some Elemental Mastery if you want with Attack, Crit Rate, Crit Damage, and Elemental Recharge built in. I will say that as far as 4-stars go, I think Sucrose is going to be the best Anemo option for that. Now moving on to Jean. Jean can serve as your healer if you don't want to run Diona. She also can run the Viridescent set, so she can get that Resistance Shred going, but I will say that her crowd control capabilities are definitely lacking compared to someone like Sucrose, Venti, or Kazuha, and sometimes her elemental skill can actually knock enemies back, which could be kind of troublesome in some situations, but I still think she could fulfill that healer role and apply some Anemo in terms of shredding enemy resistances. Now moving on, we have Venti, and Venti is obviously one of the greatest, if not the best, crowd control unit in the entire game with his ultimate, but I could see this actually being pretty annoying with AYAKA when she tries to melee them, and I've had that sort of experience when I used to play a lot of Kaching. However, with his ultimate, Ayaka's skill and ultimate should work just fine with dealing cryo damage to enemies in that whirlwind, and you could also still infuse Hydro and Cryo into Venti's ultimate in certain cases, so you might actually be able to get some permafreeze still going there. But I know a lot of people don't have Venti, so I think Sucrose is still going to be a really good option for this Anemo slot. Now moving on, we have the Anemo MC, who I'm just going to say is okay, not the best, not the absolute worst. The main issue with them is that their skill and burst tend to knock enemies back or carry them away, which I could see being very annoying when you're trying to keep enemies close together and permafreeze them. Also, the Anemo MC doesn't really apply much crowd control in general compared to someone like Sucrose, which we previously mentioned. Now, the next Anemo unit we'll talk about is Kazuha, which Kazuha I think actually is the best Anemo option, or at least one of the best Anemo options, because he doesn't actually knock enemies away or pick them up like Venti or Sucrose or Anemo MC. Also, he can infuse Hydro or Cryo in his ultimate, but I didn't want to include him first because I know many people won't have enough primos for both him and Ayaka, but if you do have him, I think he actually will be a slightly better option than Sucrose or Venti. And our last Anemo unit is going to be Sayu, who could be a potential 4-star healer for your team if you don't want to run Diona. That could also run the Viridescent Venerer set for some resistant shredding, but she doesn't seem to have a ton of crowd control from her abilities, so I really think I would still prefer Diona with another Anemo unit, but it's really up to you. So all in all, for the Anemo units, I would highly recommend Kazuha if you have him already and you're able to get Ayaka. Otherwise, I would probably go with Sucrose as the second best, and then maybe someone like Venti. Now, I know this video is getting kind of long, but we're just going to quickly go over a few other supports that you can use, and this is going to be the part of the video where we talk about why Geo is actually not going to work very well in this case. So in terms of other supports, we have both Zhongli and Albedo, which I don't think are going to be good in any of these permafreeze teams because their Geo contracts will actually shatter frozen enemies. This in essence is going to defeat the purpose of the permafreeze comp, which is to maintain the frozen status effect as long as possible and keep applying that Cryo and Hydro as often as we can. You could technically run Zhongli or Albedo for their shields as long as their construct isn't near the frozen enemies, but I think it would get pretty annoying, especially when you already have someone like Diona who can essentially fill multiple of those roles in one. I still think that Anemo is going to be a better 4th slot in this case. Now for other supports, pretty much similar to what we just talked about with Zhongli and Albedo. Other elements like Pyro and Electro, these are going to disrupt the purpose of the team comp, which is to maintain frozen enemies as often as we can, so I wouldn't recommend using them, but you could technically use someone like Bennett if you want for heals and damage buffs, because he doesn't apply an insane amount of pyro except when he has to use his skill to get his ultimate back up, and you could technically step out of his ultimate and get that damage buff still, but I don't think Bennett is really going to be necessary in any of these permafreeze comps. So the last thing we're going to cover is the physical comp and some reasons as to why I would not recommend it. One of the main reasons is that Ayaka's sprint will cause her sword to pretty much be infused with cryo all the time. This is going to make it really hard for her to maintain pure Phys damage. However, it may still be possible to do a physical build. You know, people will definitely try it and some people will probably achieve it. I just think we're trying to take the path of least resistance here, and we're trying to build a team around Ayaka that's going to be the most suitable and kind of easygoing so that we can constantly deal damage and utilize her cryo capabilities. So I know you can also run melt comps with Ayaka. I don't think they're going to be the best option per se, but you definitely can get some high damage numbers from them, but we're not going to cover them in this video just because of how long it already is. So this is pretty much going to be where we call it. If you can, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. I hope you all can get Ayaka for those of you that are going for her. But other than that, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.